Hi, Jan, and it's great to have you.
Hi, thank you.
I've been looking forward to this conversation very, very much. Firstly, because I love talking about Rembrandt. He's one of my favorite artists in the world. And secondly, because you're one of firstly, you're an art dealer and you are one of the world's leading experts on Rembrandt. And you had the incredible experience of uncovering an unknown Rembrandt, which I could, who else has done that? That's an absolute incredible feat to have achieved. Can you introduce yourself a little bit more?
Uh, well, primarily I am a dealer. However, I don't really like dealing. So I
Mm,
see myself more as a collector that has to sell in order to live.
right.
But I would be people should would probably see me more like a hoarder of nice stuff. Focusing on paintings and drawings. But I don't do art fairs. I hardly ever advertise. I like to stay out of the limelight. I I saw the limelight for a couple of years, but I decided it's not for me, and so I'm operating more in the let's say the shadow of the art trade. And more, I love the idea of writing books and writing essays about Rembrandt or about painting or drawings in order to understand him better and also the period that he was working in.
So
Um,
you're a reluctant art dealer. You've sort of it's been
well, in the past they would call it a scholar dealer, and I think that that well that would be a very praiseworthy way of putting it. But I am more like I see myself like a boy who's still very enthusiastic about finding stuff.
yeah.
And although I'm a father and I'm turning 47, so I'm not a boy anymore, I feel I'm still a boy. And I can still get very excited about very little things, little, you know, details that nobody really understood and that I love. And
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. You still have you clearly have an incredible passion for Rembrandt.
yeah,
Um, as do I. And your family has this amazing direct link back to Rembrandt himself. Could you expand on that a little bit?
well, funny that you mentioned this. I mean, our family was collecting art since many generations, and we have this tradition where the oldest son is called Jan. So I am the 11th Jan, and the first Jan was a friend of Rembrandt. Uh, to say it plainly, simple. But as we speak, I am still writing yet another big book about Rembrandt, and it is again a sort of a catalogue raisonné, slightly different. Uh, but to sort of crawl out of the tunnel of just looking at pictures, I sometimes go back to the introduction. And everybody always says you should write an introduction at the very end, but I'm writing the introduction in bits and pieces along the way. And one of the things that struck me was why is it Rembrandt? Why didn't I, find passion in the work of other artists? Because there's so many artists, and is it purely because Rembrandt was always around? And this crazy idea came to mind that if we would go back to the 17th century and we would actually go back to the moments where Rembrandt and my ancestor Jan would have, sat in the same room, one posing, one painting, and probably talking about art. I had this crazy idea. What would have happened if Jan decided not to go to Rembrandt
Amazing.
and go to, let's say, Bartholomeus van der Helst or a lesser portraitist, go to, name them. There were so many portraitists in the 17th century, but somebody that now lives in the depot of the Rijksmuseum and nobody have ever heard of. If
No,
that,
exactly, because during the Dutch Golden Age there was such talent everywhere,
yeah,
and of course Rembrandt was the most famous artist in Amsterdam, but there were many other artists that were very famous too, and that's a very mysterious sort of thing about life, isn't it? That
But if he
you're
had made the different choice, would that
exactly.
mean that I would probably now be a lawyer or a doctor, or definitely not absorbed by Rembrandt? And it's a crazy little mind game that a decision 400 years ago would lead to such big outcome, at least for my life. I mean, it had for my ancestors, but it definitely has for me.
Yeah, and it's sort of untangible. It's you'll never know the answer, but it's a fascinating idea to think
Well,
about their first meeting. How, I mean, do you have any information about how your ancestor Jan Six the First met Rembrandt initially? Do you know how he was
well,
introduced, how it came about?
I think probably because his mother had her portrait done by Rembrandt in 1641, and I can only assume, and yes, it is an assumption that Jan would have probably walked in. I mean, I don't think
And do
Rembrandt.
you know how his mother
Well,
was introduced?
I don't think sitters would go to Rembrandt's studio. I think Rembrandt would probably go to the house of the people themselves, uh, purely for a practical reason. Because if you want somebody to sit in your studio, you are asking them a lot of time.
Yeah.
And you can sit for an hour, maybe 2 hours, and then it becomes really boring. So you'll have multiple sessions. But if somebody is a captain of industry or very important, and in this case, the mother of Jan Six was running the family business because the father, Jean Six, already died. I can make the assumption that she probably didn't have so much time at hand to just sit there for hours in his studio. And it's far more feasible that he actually would go to her house on her, in her domain to say, Madam, we would need 2 hours and then I'll leave you to it. And then I'll come back the day after or the day after and we'll finish
Mm.
the portrait and then finalize it in the studio with the
And
cloak.
do you have any documentation in family sort of documentation about how Jan Six the First's mother was first introduced to Rembrandt?
No,
Would
but
she
she
have
was,
wanted sort of for family reasons to have her portrait done
well, I think
and then
everybody,
gone
I
out
think,
into sort of was recommended him, or how did it come about?
well, I think that everybody in the 17th century with money would probably want a portrait.
Sure.
That it was a tradition to counter the um, other countries. I mean, England was run by the monarchy, and France was run by the monarchy, and in Holland we have the Princess of Orange, but it's The Hague. Amsterdam clearly wasn't impressed. They were by far more wealthy, and so they had to oppose the French and English nobility. And the
Mhm.
only way to do that, if you want to do business, is to have yourself portrayed so that you have your own tradition. So it makes a lot of sense that the burghers of Amsterdam wanted to have themselves portrayed for prosperity. And
It
uh,
was a sort of a similar tradition to the Venetian tradition,
yeah,
because the Venetians were a mercantile people,
exactly.
slightly before the Dutch Empire,
Yeah,
and there was portraiture in Venice at the time. Titian, etc., was very strong. And then you get
yeah,
the Dutch tradition in the Dutch Golden Age, where
exactly.
portraiture sort of took it to the next level.
Yeah, and I think practically, the mother Anna, she was
Mm.
living, let's say, 50 meters from Eilenberg studio or Rembrandt's later studio. So it was very convenient. It was around the corner. And I think, he was certainly one of the best. I'm not sure in the 17th century if he was regarded as the best, but he was considered as being one of the best.
Mhm.
And it was practical. I think
Mm.
so. And in 41, he was preparing the night watch or in the process of painting the night watch. So yeah, he was a big rising star. He got a big commission, and I think the night watch really cemented everything.
And was it during that time that he painted
Sure.
Jan Six the First's mother's
No.
portrait, or was
Oh yeah,
that
yeah, yeah, yeah. The
that
mother's
was the time?
portrait, and then I think a couple of years later he makes the famous etching of Jan at the window, and that
Right.
would probably be the first consignment by Jan to ask Rembrandt to make his sort of informal portrait. in
because they were great friends. So I mean, you assume that, let's just say that your Jan the First's mother was getting painted by Rembrandt in their house. He walked in and he started talking to Rembrandt, and that's how they became friends.
Well, yes, and I think also that Jan wasn't a businessman. He was a. I mean, there was so much money that he collected. He
Mm-hmm.
was, they were French nobility, and he they had a big fortune, so he was allowed to spend his time in practically in leisure and start collecting art. And his art collection, I mean, he did a grand tour to Italy. He educated himself properly. He studied medicine and law. So he was a man of the world. And I think that he was very, very interested in let's say contemporary art. And Rembrandt was, the let's say, well, he's dead now, but the Lucian Freud of his days.
Sure.
And to have a person like that in your house with a clear view of what art should be or where it should go. And I think, this is something that people don't realize, but I think that Rembrandt had a very great sense of Italian art. And he really, really loved Italian art. And he collected many etchings by Raimondi and by Raphael and by you name them, and many etchings after great Italian works of art. And he copied Leonardo
and he used his first name, which wasn't common in Northern
exactly,
Europe.
exactly.
He
So
copied the tradition of Leonardo and
yeah,
Michelangelo using their first name, their Christian names.
and I
So
think
he chose to use Rembrandt.
yeah, and I think that because Constant Huygens, one of the political leaders in 17th century Holland, wrote in his diary. He had a direct conversation with Rembrandt and Lievens in their Leiden studio. And he wrote down that both boys didn't want to travel to Italy because they were under the impression that there was so much great Italian art already in Holland. So there's no use of going over the Alps. I think it's more a dogmatic thing that somebody wrote it down, and it doesn't necessarily mean that Rembrandt or Lievens the rest of their life had no interest in Italy. I mean, they had a very big interest in Italy, but it wasn't. It's a young man's thing to do, and once you grow up and you have a family, you've got a business to run, you remain where you are.
Sure. And Rembrandt early in his career was probably struggling to make it, and he was focused on that rather than having the money to go on a
That
trip.
and I think that the only person in Italy that probably would have been a very big influence is Titian.
Mm.
And there were really a lot of Titians in Amsterdam at that time.
Well, Titian famously
Yeah,
liked to sell in foreign markets because he could charge more for his art. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
the best Titians in the world to go and see are in Spain. You don't go to Venice to see the Titians.
Exactly.
So
And so I mean, I think that most of the disegno, the concept of Italian tradition would be interesting, but the way it's executed, aside from Titian, what was less of interest to him. I mean,
mm,
Rembrandt, I mean, he had so many periods, but if you really look closely to his development, you see that he becomes this old Titian, this alte Stil, this very loose way of painting.
yeah. And so did I mean, not so much the looseness, but other Dutch artists from the Low Countries like Anthony van Dyck was obsessed with Titian.
Sure.
Not so much in the grand Baroque
No.
paintings of Rome. The Dutch artists, they really did like that intimacy and that
Yeah.
psychology and that pathos that you see in the Venetian portraits, but
Yeah.
very much you get in Dutch portraiture, and especially in Titian. Sorry, especially in Rembrandt. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no painter that paints psychology like Rembrandt. He just takes it to another level,
Yeah.
and there's a mystery as to
And
why
yeah.
does he? Why is he
Well,
able
this
to?
is another, it's very interesting. I mean, we are all children of psychology. I mean, after Freud famously sort of coined the academic understanding of psychology, we think from a psychological framework. But I mean, again, I wasn't there, so it's an assumption, but I hesitate to think that Rembrandt looked at the paint at the person and thought, I am going to depict that person to understand their psyche. I think it's something completely different, and that's not what people want to hear. But I think that Rembrandt was less interested in the person behind the face, but he was interested in the face. He was interested in nature. So if you really take time to look very, very good at your subject, even if you're a photographer, if you take a camera and you just put a person in a chair, you take a photo, it will never be a great portrait. The great portraits happen after you start to understand your subject. So, Richard Avedon would talk for hours with his subjects and shoot many photos, but after hours, he would start to understand the person behind the face.
Mm.
I think that Rembrandt took extensive time to learn a person, but to observe the micro mimics, to
So
understand.
you're that's a very interesting take on it, and I've never thought about it that way. But you're saying that Rembrandt looked at people almost in an animalistic way, like they are
Yes,
human animals that
yes,
I'm observing in
yeah,
nature, rather than
and
psychological
yes, and
beings.
I can't prove it because
Mm,
again, he left so little in writing, and I don't know him, but I can
mm,
only see what he left us. But there is one sentence from one of his letters. I think there's 9 or 11 letters left, and in one letter he says that that the painting should have the natuurlijkste beweging, which is Dutch for the most natural movement. And movement is always, understood as the psychological behavior of the subject.
mm.
And
That's
and
fascinating.
I
That's a
disagree.
fascinating observation.
Yeah, but I disagree. I think that Rembrandt means movement not in what moves you, but in movement of how you move, literally how you uh, how you interact with life.
Mm, mm.
So
So obviously the connection started from Jan Sixth the First's mother being painted. Her portrait was painted,
yeah.
and then Jan Sixth the First was portrait was painted. Was that the next painting in the collection, the next Rembrandt in the family collection?
No, so you have the mother being painted first, and then in my view, Jan asks for a portrait in etching form, and luckily we have the preparatory drawings, and we have a little sketch,
Mm-hmm.
pencil, as an in-between phase. So we know that from the very start, he asked for a full-length portrait in etching form.
Mm-hmm.
So the first preparatory drawing is him standing at a window, looking at you,
Mm-hmm.
and holding a piece of paper. So he wants to be placed within an interior showing what he does, which is probably writing theater plays, because
Right.
he wrote many theater plays in his.
So he was born into wealth, and he was a cultured man
Yeah,
that
yeah.
wanted to be known as a cultured person, not as just a
Oh yeah.
merchant, so to speak.
Well, I don't think he was a merchant at all. I think the family owned the business, but he was just spending the money.
Yeah.
And um, in a sense, wisely, but that's in hindsight because he bought many great art pieces, and it brought a lot of wealth to the family over the centuries. But for him, I think it was sort of playing and creating his own life in luxury.
And how many Rembrandts did he collect? Because obviously they lived, they
Well,
were friends together.
that's also a bit difficult because the only momentum you have is, of course, at his death. You can see his inventory of his house.
Mm.
So, and at that moment, I think uh, in the inventory it states 6 or 7 paintings by Rembrandt.
Okay. And is that including etchings or paint six or
No, no,
seven paintings?
just
Uh,
paintings. Yeah.
Right. And how many do you still have in your family collection of those
So
six?
the only two, it's Jan's portrait and his mother. So those two
Hmm.
always remained within the family. But I mean, we also know that in, I think, 1658 or 54, uh, Jan gave a loan to Rembrandt without interest, which is quite generous. And
Mm.
as a it was sort of a loan to get money, but he gave paintings of himself and of Lievens as a security.
Mm.
So we know that he gave the portrait of Saskia in profile, which is now in Kassel,
Yeah.
the famous lovely lady in red.
Hmm.
And he gave a small painting, which is probably the little Abram and the Angels that was sold at Sotheby's a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
And he gave the third one, which slipped my mind. But he during his lifetime, he clearly amassed pictures either via loan or he bought pictures. But what I'm
Did he
trying
give any self-portraits?
no, but what I'm trying to say is that
Mm.
we don't really know if Jan bought paintings and already sold paintings during his life,
Mm.
because that we don't have any documentation on. And I think that nowadays we usually buy paintings and then we collect it in a collection, and then when we die or when we divorce or when we donate, we give it away or it breaks up. But I think in the 17th century it was far more fluid. So you would buy things to hang and to enjoy, but also as an investment. And sometimes you could say, I'm fed up with these Italian paintings and I want other paintings and I will sell everything. So it's not necessary that pictures were sold when people died. And I'm stressing that out because it could mean that during his whole lifetime, Jan might have had many, many more Rembrandt paintings that we don't know of because simply it's
Mm.
not documented. What we do know is that when he died, also in his inventory was the complete full set of all the etchings, which is quite rare. That during his lifetime, he already collected every etching that Rembrandt made.
Mm.
And I always
Yeah,
find,
I mean it's because Rembrandt now in the history of art is like a godlike figure, and
yeah,
all his paintings are just like these miraculous things that just rarely come on the market, and they're held in the best museums in the world. Whereas for your ancestor, he was just his friend, and he probably saw many of his paintings
well,
every day, and so they weren't this huge currency, this sort of miraculous currency that they are now.
no, but again, and that's why I dare to say that yet another book on Rembrandt is probably necessary. Is that I think there are so many assumptions over the centuries, and especially the last 50 years when psychology got such a important place within researching Rembrandt, is that we do assume a lot, and
Mm.
I really don't know if they were friends. I don't know if they were good acquaintances or
Okay.
if it did have more of a business understanding. It's difficult because the hierarchy of life was completely different. I mean, in England, you have more of a class system than we have in Holland,
Mm.
but in the 17th century, we certainly have a class system. And the sixth family, they were the Lord Mayors of Amsterdam. They were,
Mm.
whether the top political and financial people in the city.
Mm.
Rembrandt was a painter. In other words, he made stuff, and he wasn't a god.
No.
They were emancipated decorators,
Mm.
but that's about what it was. So, I mean, nowadays we would. I mean, Lucian Freud passed away, but if I could have Lucian Freud at my dinner table, it would have been a wonderful momentum. Or would it mean that Jan Six would have the same feeling when he had Rembrandt at his dinner table with his friends? I don't know. It's interesting to think that that might be the case, but it's very much possible that it would be like a plumber. And you would
Yeah,
say,
but also, if your ancestor was a cultured man, um, he might have wanted to have different writers and artists at
yes,
his table. I mean, Titian was famously very good friends, best friends with Aretino, and he was an artist in the sense he was a writer, he was a playwright, and he was a
yeah,
poet. Um, and so they were very good friends, and they would wine and dine together. That might have been the case in, I don't know, you know more about Dutch society at the
Yeah,
time. That might have been the case.
it might have been. The problem is that we have so little documentation to be certain, and so I don't want this book to become so dry and unreadable that there's no fun to flip through it. So
no, but I think that's a very good point of how Rembrandt has changed through the centuries, and now he's this godlike figure in the history of art, and it's very difficult to sort of strip all that away and understand at some point he was just an artist in Amsterdam, struggling to get by like the rest of the artistic society of Amsterdam. That's a very he had to pay his bills. He was a real person. He had to
he had off days. He lost wives. He lost he didn't get married 3 times, but he certainly went through the system of divorce. The first wife dies, the second one he has to send away to the prison, the third one dies at the very end. I mean, he went through a great ordeal, and the end of his life, is probably his most precious child. Titus dies under his nose from probably a plague. So and
a year before he died, almost like he couldn't face it anymore, like he was just brokenhearted.
Exactly. So, but then again, if you look at all the documents, if you look at all the hard facts, so his death certificate or his baptismal record or the things that we can't discuss because they're simply there. If you look at all those things and you visualize this as a desk, like we all have a desk with drawers, and I would look at the desk of Rembrandt. What I see is a desk filled with maybe 30 little snippets of his life. And what art history has done, all these professors and people thinking about him have created this wonderful life of Rembrandt, this vision of Rembrandt based on those 30 snippets. I think this is ludicrous, because if I open your desk now and I would take, a parking ticket and a letter from a teacher and a love letter from one of your ex-girlfriends, you name it, and I then compose who you are, it has nothing to do with who you are.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a very, very valid point. And another example of this in art history is Caravaggio. So the only information we have about Caravaggio is court documents of when he's in trouble with the police. So we make him out to be this violent, crazy genius.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
And so what I'm always advocating for is to calm down and to take a step back and just to look at the facts that we have and the paintings that he left us, and also remembering that you shouldn't combine everything. It's very easy to do so, because you don't have any other ways to make something out of it. But Saskia dies and he only makes these drawings and etchings of landscapes. So everybody says, oh, he was grieving. He was only walking through nature to get away from grief. Okay, but isn't that making an assumption of how you would go through grief, instead of leaving it at what it is and just saying the wife dies and then the artist lives on, and then he starts to focus on landscapes? Whatever the reason behind it is doesn't really matter, because we can't pin it down anyway. But it's too easy to say, he didn't want to be with people, he just wants to be on himself, and he walked through nature for 4 years. I think that is complete nonsense.
I mean, that happened to John Singer Sargent. He got sick of painting portraits and he went and painted landscapes for years. We could add grief into it. We could almost add anything we wanted into that storyline, but it doesn't really prove what happened. But the reality is,
I think we shouldn't do that, because what happens is that if we do that and we in a way create an artist, because that's what it is. It's you create somebody afterwards. If you then find a new painting or a new drawing or a new source or whatever, you will confront it with the image that you have postulated. So the problem then is that if it doesn't really fit, you start to doubt. Now, for attributions, this is very important
Mm.
because it can make or change somebody's life. And
Yeah, and so so
I'm very careful about following this set in stone image of an artist, so that whatever new comes along might or might not fit.
mm, it takes out the nuance. It takes out the he might
Yeah.
have had an off day and wanted to experiment, and an
So
expert might look at that painting and think, well, he wasn't painting in
yeah.
this style at that time, so it can't be.
So for instance, in the 20s, I think I have to look it up, but I think in the 20s, Abram Bradius, one of the leading researchers at that time in Holland, found in an archive the first time the lawsuits where Rembrandt was actively trying to send his second wife Geertje to prison. When he found it, it should have been, big feast. You find new
Mm,
stuff on Rembrandt. What he did is he hid it.
mm.
He muffled it away because that was not what he wanted Rembrandt to be.
Yeah, it didn't make sense in his head to the
Exactly.
narrative, so it couldn't
And what
be.
happened is that if you look at the 20s and 30s and you look at the pictures that come up on resurface on the market, and it had anything to do with, naked ladies or brothels or whatever, it was immediate doubt. Rembrandt didn't like that. It was too personal. It was,
Mm,
no, we have a completely different sense of Rembrandt.
mm.
Later on, when these documents are relocated and we make him more human, the humanistic approach to Rembrandt changes dramatically. So then all of a sudden there's far more emphasis on naked female studies, or he becomes more human.
Yeah. It's very interesting what you say. It is also difficult because history is often a lot of the imagination. You need to imagine how things would be.
Yeah,
But I do agree with you that things get taken out completely out of context, and a false narrative gets written and made over the years.
yeah.
When your ancestor Jan Six I lent Rembrandt this money without interest, which I agree was very generous, and I think does imply that they had a closer relationship. You saying they're not friends, I think maybe they could have been closer, some sort of cultural acquaintances. But
Again,
was he bankrupt at the time? Was this after his bankruptcy or?
no, before. And again, the thing is, for us, we quickly make the assumption that if you don't charge interest, you must be a friend.
Mm.
But
But
again,
it's also a Christian thing, isn't it?
we weren't there.
Yeah.
To analyze the cultural nuances of the day when you're not living in that day,
Mm.
I find very, very difficult.
Mm. So, do you have any feeling of what the actual story is there, or do you just leave it to
No,
mystery?
I allow myself to think away, and I live in Amsterdam. I see the same buildings. I in my house, I live in a 17th century building, and there are 17th century tiles, and we have 17th century glasses and cups, and history is never far away. So
Mm.
you can dream away, and so I do allow myself to turn Rembrandt into flesh in my mind and to see
Mm.
what sort of character would he have been. But I always keep a very strict division between what you think and what
Mm.
you want and what you know and what you can work with,
Mm.
because otherwise it's a circus. And especially after the death of Professor van der Wetering, who was the great scholar of the, let's say, 20th century,
Yeah.
um, on Rembrandt. I think that we landed in some sort of vacuum regarding Rembrandt, and there are some people that are pushed forward to be the new experts.
Mm.
I don't believe that that's a good thing. I think that Rembrandt is part, not of all of us, but for all of us, and that we
Mm.
can all have an
He
opinion.
also has a particular significance in Holland,
Yes.
because he sort of represents something greater than, there's no other country in the world that has the night watch that represents their country.
Yeah.
The Mona Lisa represents maybe France. It's not in the same way. There's no painting in England that,
No.
there's Turner paintings, but there's something different about the connection that the Dutch
Yeah.
have to Rembrandt. Which is
Yes.
strange because at the time, he went bankrupt and he sort of fell out of fashion, but he
Yeah.
stayed in that cultural zeitgeist with Dutch people until today in a very, very strong way. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yes. But for Dutch people, it's very natural because we all grew up. Many of our streets are named after artists, and you learn it in school, and it's everywhere, especially in Amsterdam. It's almost like a religion. And of course, the Rijksmuseum is built like a cathedral with the night watch as the altarpiece in the center aisle.
Mm.
It is almost a religion.
And does Rijksmuseum literally mean people's museum?
Well, it's the Museum of the Reich or of the Reich.
And what does Reich mean?
Empire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Right.
which is
Um,
strange because we well, I would say more kingdom, the kingdom's museum.
I when I went there, I was just blown away by the. I mean, it's one of the world's leading museums, but also, the bikes you can ride straight through the museum on your bicycle. It
It's
couldn't.
funny. It's funny because to me, the Rijksmuseum is a very local national museum. It focuses only on Dutch art and a little bit of Flemish. And if you're lucky, you see one or two Italian pictures and then one Spanish picture. But it's a sort of a very small dogmatic thing. For me, the big museums are the National Gallery and the Hermitage and the Louvre, and the big overall museums. But because the focus and the concentration of Dutch art is so massive and big and
Yeah.
and fantastic, the level of quality is like the Mauritshuis. It's that is sort of an epic, sublimated, uh, tiny little dot of pure quality. It blows you away. But when you put it in perspective, the Rijksmuseum, of course, they show only 8,000 objects. It's smaller than one of the wings of the Metropolitan. It's nothing. But because it's
Because
very,
of quality, though. I mean, as
yeah,
an artist, and an art historian, I want to, there's periods in art history that were very, very strong. And one of those periods is the Dutch Golden Age. And if you want to go
absolutely,
and see the Dutch Golden Age, you go to the Rijksmuseum.
yeah.
It's just there on show
And
in
I,
such
and
a
I
profound
think
way.
and I think with the Uffizi, it's the Rijksmuseum should be like the Uffizi. It's a similar sort of setup, but it isn't because there are so many great Italian pictures of much better quality and condition outside of Italy
Mm.
that it has a different feel to it. So I do understand what you're saying, but because this is my hometown and I literally I can walk blindfolded through the Rijksmuseum and find everything back. For me it's, and I don't mean this in a snobby way, but it's almost too normal.
No, I understand where you're coming
Yeah.
from. I've been to the National Gallery in London many, many times. So many times I can't even count. So it's for me, it's the paintings in there. Sort of, they become normal to look at. Whereas,
Yeah.
the idea of me going to Amsterdam and looking at Rembrandts in the Rijksmuseum is something completely different. But let's get back to the portrait of Jan Six that Rembrandt did. So is there any information you have? You say there's little information about Rembrandt. Is there any information you have about that particular portrait, or is it just that portrait that you have? Do you have any letters, any
No,
information at all?
no,
No.
no, no. There is in the diary of Jan. He kept sort of a semi-diary. It's more like a collection of thoughts and ideas and concepts, but it sometimes it's dated. So I would consider it as a sort of a thought, a train of thought book. There is a little note somewhere where in the sideline it says on my portrait, but it doesn't mean it's on that portrait because he
Hmm.
had 7 portraits of himself by different artists. And then it's a Latin line, and it's a sort of a word joke that if certain letters are used, you can form a year. So the free translation is, "Here I am in the most blossomly uh, moment of my youth."
Hmm.
Uh, and then if you combine certain letters, it says 1654.
Hmm.
And so automatically, everybody in the past said, "Oh well, that's on his portrait, the Rembrandt." So he is there. He wrote um, this little line to commemorate his portrait by Rembrandt. But if you add up the numbers, it's 1654, and if you look at the portrait, which is not dated, that would mean that the sitter is 32 years old.
Mm.
And since I was very young, I always completely doubted that, because to me he's much older. So I said, no, no way that Rembrandt painted him in 1654 at age 32. What I'm looking at, and you might be able to show an image of the painting in this interview, you'll see, hopefully concur with me, that the sitter is much older. And we do have a terminus ante quem, because we know that Rembrandt died in 1669. So, top age would be, if I calculate quickly, he was born in 1618, so he would be 51.
He looks a lot older in his late portraits than 51.
Yeah. So, if I now look at Rembrandt's oeuvre and I would place the portrait, I would say it would be mid-60s. So at least 10 years later.
So you think that the portrait of Jan VI I was when he was how old?
Well,
60.
1618 minus 1664, let's say. So what is it? 42, 43. But the reason why I'm thinking this is not only because of the fact that link, that written link, doesn't add up, because it could have been about any portrait of Jan VI. But I think that most of the late Rembrandts have been in museums since a very long time. So whenever there's a Rembrandt on the market, it's usually an early Rembrandt or a Rembrandt from the mid decennia. Late Rembrandts have been collected by kings, emperors, and collectioners, and they all remain in public collections, which means that most of these pictures have been restored extensively. Because usually when a picture goes to the trade or when it goes to public collection, every generation or every second generation decides to have the painting re-restored. Look at the Night Watch, they're doing it again. Everybody wants to sort of pee over their Rembrandt and change it. As a result, in my view, the late Rembrandt is completely misunderstood, because there's no book available that shows you late Rembrandt paintings in the clean state. So you don't really know what you're looking at. And what I sense in all my research and looking at X-rays and looking at the paintings as they appear, I sense that most of the late Rembrandts are over cleaned or over restored. So, think of the late self-portrait in the National Gallery. Pretty overpainted. If you look at the hand, it's almost gone. And I really started to understand this in the exhibition, The Late Rembrandt, which was at the National Gallery and later in the Rijksmuseum. And
they still stand up, though. Some overcleaned portraits fall down.
Completely.
Yeah.
However, when the exhibition took place and the portrait of my ancestor was hung in the exhibition next to all the other later Rembrandts.
You're talking about the late Rembrandt exhibition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was hung in the exhibition as being one of the first or earlier late Rembrandts.
Yeah.
Because academics still dictate that it's painted in 1654. I started to explain to people, have a look how it would fit within the mid-60s. And actually, the picture as a design fits perfectly well in the mid-60s.
Well, I agree with that. I do agree with that. And I'm not, I'm someone with just a passion for Rembrandt. I'm not an expert, but I do agree with what you've said. And I've always thought, I know it's always been classified as an early, late Rembrandt. And I've always thought that the style, especially when he's using his fingers to make the red marks on the coat, it's just too loose. He was doing that sort of much later on, very, very late.
But it's difficult to compare because most of these later Rembrandts, in my view, again, have been over cleaned. So what you compare is a picture that always remained in private hands. In other words, is almost in mint condition.
Yeah.
To over clean pictures.
Yeah. Have you had your portrait of Jan VI cleaned?
Yes, it was cleaned. The old varnish was taken off and it was relined.
Hmm.
It was relined on a vacuum table, so
Hmm.
there's no distortions. If you stand in front of the picture, the brushwork is completely intact,
Mm.
so it's not flat.
But what I'm asking you is, have you so you've had it restored, but have you had it restored less than other late portraits? For example, the one.
It only was restored in, I think, 1984, first time ever,
Yeah.
because it was on the original canvas and it had the original varnish and it was never touched.
Right.
So it was done in the Rijksmuseum, and I think according to the condition report or the restoration report, they said out of precaution, let's reline it because it might break at the ends,
Right.
the sides, and
Mm.
let's clean it off. And they cleaned it and they said, oh, it's in fantastic condition because it was never restored.
Mm.
So we just have to revarnish it. I think
Hmm.
in the background there's one or two little black dots that are not even necessary,
Mm.
which means that this is a Rembrandt that you actually never ever see. It is incomparable on the basis of condition.
Hmm.
Now, this is vital to understand Rembrandt
Mm.
because what we have analyzed, aside from this portrait, is a oeuvre that for probably 60 to 70% has been restored per painting.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
sometimes, I mean, I said as a joke, what we should do in the exhibition, we should hang these disco lights, these UV lights, to turn them all on and see what we're actually looking at. Because
Mm.
reality is that it's a Rembrandt show. What you're looking at is Rembrandt and, dozens of restorers and their
Mm.
interpretation of things that are lost to time.
Mm. Mm.
Now, the curators looked at me and said, "Are you an idiot? Of course we're not going to do that." But on a pure academic level, to train your eye, you should do that.
Yeah.
And then you get a completely different outcome of how to place pictures. And so it made me stronger in believing that a new book is necessary to give a different view on how to place Rembrandt and how to see how his development changed.
Mm.
If you do that and you remain very strict to what you see instead of what you know and what has been told to you, then you can get a better sense of his oeuvre and you can make better judgments for attributions, which again is so important because that's what I do. I make attributions.
And in your book, would you focus on the late Rembrandts or would you
No,
focus on his
everything,
whole career? Yeah.
everything, because from the very start, as a young child, I never understood why the academic field took the paintings, the drawings, and the etchings apart.
Mm.
It's three islands.
Mm.
And I never understood that. And
Mm.
all the professors said, well, there's no correlation between the three groups of items. And I said, that's nonsense. The correlation
Mm.
is that Rembrandt made everything. So he's the correlation. It just means that we don't see how it's correlated. And of
And
course,
what's what why do you think that late Rembrandts were so collected by the nobility, etc.? Because essentially he went bankrupt, and I mean, the story that that is told in art history is his style completely changed, and
yeah,
it's very it's loved, it's worshipped, that style.
yeah.
But
Well, he
in
was,
his time,
yeah,
clearly that was a style that was going out of fashion.
yeah.
But
But he was collected. Again, we have to analyze this, in my view, in a slightly different way, because if you focus on late Rembrandt, it's mostly portraits
mm,
with some historical paintings, but lesser so. It's mostly portraits. And of course,
mhm,
that's what you do to make money. You want to make money with history paintings, but they're difficult to sell because you have to
mhm,
convince a person to buy something that they don't need. But a portrait they need because
right,
they don't have a camera. So to make a portrait that gives you less money, but it's more a security of money,
yeah,
that's the reason why at the later age in his life, he started to do more and more portraits because he simply needed to make money. And when somebody's sitting in the studio posing, and there are all these history paintings hanging on the wall drying or ready to be, retouched a bit, he could very easily talk about these paintings and try to sell them to the clientele.
mm,
So when you say the late Rembrandt was massively collected, no, it was more practical. I mean, at the later stage of his life, he was doing these portraits to survive. And
mm,
when you have your portrait done, you keep your portrait. You're not going to paint your portrait and sell your own portrait.
Right.
So they remained in the families. And because it is the portrait of mom or dad or great grandfather, whatever, they remain for two, three, four generations. And then they change because they're no longer a portrait, they're a Rembrandt.
Yeah.
And then the English nobility starts to, really make money, and they buy Rembrandts. They don't buy Mr. Tripp or Mr. Van Loon or Mr. You name them. No, they buy Rembrandts.
Mm.
And the sitters, nobody cares. And in the first John Smith Catalog Resonance, most of the sitters are famous people, Dr. Tulp,
Mm.
Mr. Six, or you name them.
So you're saying after he went bankrupt, he was still selling his art
Oh yeah.
consistently, but
Oh yeah.
it was more portraits and it was more smaller work.
Yes, and we have a file where Rembrandt couldn't work for himself because he was bankrupt, which
Mhm.
means that if he would make money again, those who wanted their money back could charge him on a personal title. So Titus and his third wife Hendrikje created a new firm. We don't
Right.
know the name, but let's call it Van Rijn Limited. And Titus and the wife Hendrikje were the directors, and Rembrandt was a person working for them.
Like a limited liability company that
Exactly.
is sort of out of Rembrandt's control.
Exactly. That's how it was.
So he was still making plenty of money. It
Oh
just wasn't
yes.
directly in his name.
Well, it wouldn't been plenty of money, but it was still making money. And
Do you know what his studio, where he moved to? After,
yes,
obviously, when you go
yeah,
to Amsterdam, you can see his famous house, but
yeah.
he had to sell that. And where did he move? Was it a
He
big
moved.
house? Was it a big studio?
No, he moved to the what is now called the Rozengracht, or the Canal of the Roses, which is now like a highway. It doesn't. It's not really pretty.
Mm.
It starts at the foot of the Western Church, the church where he is buried. That's why he's buried there, because it's close by. And if you go there now, I used to cycle there a lot because before I lived in the house where I'm living now, I used to live around the corner of that place. And it's now a tattoo parlor.
Wow.
And it has a plaque on the wall saying, "Here lived Rembrandt until he died," which is probably not the same house. I think it's a 19th century house, but it's the place where the house stood. Yeah.
And that's amazing. And yeah, there's nothing left. There's no grave. There's no grave to know where he was buried or anything like that. But
No.
what do you think the last years of his life were like? Because I find the self portraits, his late self portraits. There's the one in Kenwood House. There's the
Yes.
one in the National Gallery in London, and then there's the one in The Hague,
Yeah.
which are the three sort of late self portraits,
Yeah.
and they are so intense to look at.
Yeah.
There's a real intensity, and there's a sort of it's beyond sadness. It's just a real observation of, is this my life? What
Yeah.
just when I look at them, it's just like, here I
Well,
am. I've somehow survived my children,
listen,
my
Nick.
wives, and here I am. What else? What do you feel when you look at
Well,
them?
again, this is so difficult. I don't know.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
I literally I don't know. What I do know is that it's purely observational. If you look at these self-portraits and you put them like a flipping book, and you see him grow, one of the things that is very clear, it's not a debate, is that his nose grows
Yeah.
massively.
Mm.
And the final 4 or 5 portraits,
Almost like an alcoholic nose, kind of.
exactly. And the
Mm,
last 4 or 5 portraits show more of a yellowish hue on his cheeks.
mm,
Now, before these pictures were restored, people said, "Oh, that's the varnish," but it's not. These pictures are now all restored, and you can see that his cheeks become more yellowish. And one of the key things of alcohol poisoning or overconsumption is that your skin becomes yellowish.
yeah, sure.
Your
Liver damage.
liver fails. So I am, and now I'm stepping over the academic
Mm,
wall of thinking. I'm pretty certain that he was a full-on alcoholic, and that
mm.
he drank his way. Oh yeah, he drank his life away. He
Through
died.
those last years, especially.
Yes, he was 63.
Mm,
And people say in the 17th century people didn't become old is ludicrous. People became very old.
mm.
It's the average that makes people not that old.
Yeah.
I don't believe that there is a thing as average, because it's just it's a figment of our imagination. No, nobody is average. It doesn't work like that. So the reason why people are assumed to die young in the 17th century is because there was so much childbirth, child death at birth.
Yeah. So it brought the average down.
So that's why people are set at 30. But
Yeah.
it's nonsense. People became 60, 70, 80. You know, my
Yeah.
ancestors all became near 100. So it's
Yeah.
nonsense.
Yeah, in fact, they kind of lived healthier lives. There was less pollution in the air. There was less
Of course.
plastics.
I mean,
The food was clean from
fish,
the
yeah,
local
of
farms.
course.
Yeah, yeah,
And they didn't have HGAD and all these pills in their kids, and they didn't have asthma and allergies for
mm,
dust and no, because their bodies were immune through life.
yeah.
But if you drink Geneva and you drink maybe from your little bucket where you put your brushes in, turpentine type, whatever he did, life goes quick.
I get the sense that, yeah, maybe it's stepping over the line, like you say again, but I get the sense that early on he was a very social guy, that he liked to drink. There's even the portrait, the
Yeah,
prodigal son of him having a beer while with Saskia sitting on his lap. It's a very jovial kind of life, but that jovial drinking can descend through hardship and through difficult times. You
yeah,
can then lean on alcohol to kind of take the pressure away, or forget about your troubles or whatever. And I think certainly later on, I'd have to agree. The yellowing of the skin, the bulbous alcoholic nose. I'm sure he was abusing alcohol to an extent that wasn't at the time probably even understood. That we look at in a modern sense, but I mean, I could imagine that to be certainly the
yeah,
case.
yeah.
Um, Now, there was a very famous documentary made about you, My Rembrandt. What are your thoughts on that documentary? How did that come about? Are you proud of that? What are your thoughts?
Well, it came about by sort of in a very natural way. Is that the director of the movie, Oeke Hogendijk, made a wonderful documentary about the Rijksmuseum. And then she decided, because that was such a success, she decided to go, and she observed that building as a cathedral, and curators kept on saying it's the Cathedral of Rembrandt. So then her next step was Rembrandt.
Mhm.
And the third step she's actually doing now is the Night Watch, the whole restoration. So it's a trilogy in a way.
Wow.
And so when she focused on the man, because he's dead, she had to focus on people around Rembrandt. And she very quickly sensed that everybody had their own view of Rembrandt. So you have the big professor who looks at Rembrandt in a certain way, Van de Wetering, and you've got collectors, and you've got museum directors, and you've got all sorts of people. And she had a short interview with my father as being the curator of our family collection as a link to Rembrandt. But when she went through all the media and all the clippings on Rembrandt, she kept on, ending up with me as being a young guy working at an auction house at that time, and later on as a dealer. And I kept on saying stuff about Rembrandt and discovering Rembrandt. Well, at that time when we started, to be frank, I didn't mention anything to the media yet about discoveries. So then one day I gave a small lecture at an annual event which just happened 2 weeks ago. Is that every year at a certain date, the first sun of the season lands on Saskia's grave in the church, and we all Amsterdam people that know all go to the grave in the morning at 7 o'clock.
Oh, wow.
It's lovely. I'll send you an image of the happening a week ago. And then we celebrate Saskia's life. And there's always some idiot. And I was the one that year that gives a little speech about something that we know about Rembrandt or Saskia.
Mhm.
And I spoke briefly about that portrait of Saskia that our family once owned, and about that history. And it was
Mhm.
a lovely event. And afterwards, this lady walks up to me and she says, I'm a movie director and I'm making this documentary about Rembrandt, but I keep on ending up with you. Would you be willing to talk to me? I said, sure, come over and we'll talk about Rembrandt. And we sat down, and like now, I blabbered along about Rembrandt, and all my thoughts came on the table. And then she said, "You know what? It's so funny. Everybody who's involved with Rembrandt is old. They're all 60 plus.
Right.
And you're this young kid. I mean, I'm now 47, but back then I was 38 or so, and I looked much younger. So she said, it's so refreshing that there's another generation, you know, busy with Rembrandt. But the problem here is that I only want to interview people that are directly busy with Rembrandt, and you don't own Rembrandt.
Mm.
And I said to her, if you can keep your mouth shut till the moment I tell you, I'll show you a secret. So then I opened the cupboard and I took out my first discovery. I said, here's a Rembrandt. She said, oh my God, can I film this? And I said, absolutely. So that's how it all came about.
Wow, that's incredible
It's sort of,
coincidence.
it's sort of
And
art.
when you showed, did you show her the painting that was the portrait that was bought in My Rembrandt, or did you have another
No, I
discovery?
showed her the Christ and Little Children, which is a big history painting with the biblical story of Christ allowing all children or all souls to come to the true faith, Christianity. And in the background is a self-portrait of Rembrandt. So it was quite an easy discovery, but it was heavily overpainted. So for about 10 years, we've restored that painting. And in the documentary, you see this painting evolving in the restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I showed her that. And while filming, because we filmed for just over 4 years,
Wow.
in that process, I found the second Rembrandt.
Oh, and so that storyline developed during the
Yeah.
filming. That wasn't planned or anything.
No,
Wow.
no. So,
Wow.
you know,
And so how many Rembrandts have you uncovered officially?
officially, I would say 4.
Mm-hmm.
Unofficially, more.
More. Yeah, these
Yeah.
things take time to
But
uncover.
they will all come out.
Yeah.
I promise now that I'm not going to the media, so I will write about them. So there will be a
Well, it must
chapter
be
for
the
them.
biggest thrill in the world. It must be the most thrilling experience that you can have, much more thrilling than selling a Rembrandt, finding a
Oh
Rembrandt.
yes, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah. No, again, as I started this conversation, I don't, in the end, I don't really like being a dealer. I mean, sitting down with the client is always fun if the client loves art.
Mm-hmm.
Most wealthy people in the world, they have a lack of time.
Yeah.
So they don't want to talk endlessly about art. They just want to make the deal and then move on. And I
And unfortunately, it's a good way to park your money because
that's
it's
what it is.
tax free as well.
Yeah. No, for me, I love talking about understanding the painting.
Mm.
And Otto Naumann, who is this great art dealer who knows a lot about Rembrandt, and I think he sold most Rembrandts ever in history.
Otto Naumann.
Yeah, I think
Mm.
he sold 13 or 14 or something. Nobody ever did that. Maybe Rembrandt himself was the only one who sold. But Otto famously told me a story once that he likes to talk about painting so much that he sometimes unsells a painting.
Yeah.
But he was once at TEFAF Art Fair in his stand, and he had this client come in, and he showed this painting to the client, and then he started to explain the painting, but he kept on explaining so long that he finally said, "You know what? You shouldn't buy it because actually," and he sort of unsold it because he was too academic about it.
Wow.
And I liked, it wasn't good for business for him at that moment, but I love the concept that it's not about money in the end.
No.
Sure, you need money to buy the pictures and to sell them, and you need to live. But if it all comes down to the core of this, it's the real deep understanding. That's at least for me, that's really what it is.
Mm.
And so your question, what do you think about the documentary? I think the first half I love because it shows in all the characters. So the Rothschild family, or the Duke of Buccleuch, or my father, or the Rijksmuseum director, or myself, any of these players, you see the thrill of understanding this artist and his work. You see the immense effort people take to come closer or to make things work, to get closer. That I love. But once the commercial aspect, the jealousy within the trade, or the 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 fighting and bickering about attributions or about knowledge that is in fact not really knowledge because it's just
Mm.
hearsay and it's never really researched. All
And
that.
in fact, that there are some incredible passages of the film where the adrenaline is pumping and you're sure that it's a Rembrandt and it's being
Well,
analyzed by the experts, and the
yeah,
film is made in such a way that there's this sort of adrenaline pumping, and
yeah.
you're saying, look, I'm sure it is, it's irrefutable, it has to be, and they're discussing it, and it's made in such a way that it's really building to a
Yes,
crescendo.
and of course, the director, she cut it in a way that as a when you view it, you have no sense of time.
No,
In the
not at all.
frames, it never says this is that year or that month. Well, if you would do that, you would see that some sessions were 4 hours,
Mm,
and sometimes one scene is followed by a scene that was 3 years later. But
right.
that's very difficult. So there's one famous scene where Ernst van de Wetering walks into my gallery and he looks at this portrait of a young man and he says, "This can't be by Rembrandt." No.
Mm,
And he completely, dismisses it and he doesn't even want to discuss it anymore.
mm,
And I'm standing there and saying, "Well, you calm down, take your time. Let's find another moment to think about this again." What you don't see is that we had a session before that painting of the Christ and Little Children, the other discovery, that
mm.
lasted for 3 hours. And the professor, who is in his, near his 80s, was very tired. He was just fed up.
Yeah,
Another 3 hour session about
he
the.
doesn't want to go for another set. Yeah,
So he was fed up, and I looked at the director and I said, don't do this.
yeah.
But she rented the sound system man and the cameraman and all the people for that day. So she said,
Mm,
no, this is how I film. And I said, well, that life doesn't work like that. And so you get a scene where he dismisses it. 4 minutes later in the movie, same professor says, this is absolutely a Rembrandt, irrefutable.
yeah.
And all the people that view the documentary say, how does that work? How can
Yeah, it
somebody.
is. It is cut in such a way that all these opinions are coming at you, and
And
that's sort
nobody
of the
understands it.
adrenaline
And
to the
then
film.
I'm explaining for the last 7 or what years that in between these two scenes were 3 years,
Mm,
3 whole years of meetings, discussions, finding proof, reanalyzing X-rays, etc., etc. And of course, finally he came to the sense, because he really put time into it, that he really started to understand the painting. That is how science works.
mm,
It's not walking into a room and saying yes or no. That's nonsense. This is, sorry to say this in this podcast, in this filming, but that's bullshit. This
mm,
is rubbish.
mm.
You there's nobody that can do that. If you go to a doctor to see if you have cancer, they don't say yes and no in a minute.
No,
They'll do test after test after test.
yeah.
So Rembrandt, you can't walk into an auction room and say that's a Rembrandt.
But you did when you walked in.
Oh, no. I had a strong sense,
Yeah.
but I had to prove it to myself, and it took time.
What's that sense? Can
Well,
you explain the sense, or
some
is it just
people
something that is
some
just
some people
there?
call it intuition,
Mm,
and that's probably it's playing it down because it is not only intuition; it's also knowledge. It's
Are there specific things you're looking for in his technique? Is it more just a
no,
feeling?
it's
Is
it's
it?
it's a combination of many things. But
Yeah.
the most important thing is to have as full as possible an overview of what he did.
Mm,
My sense is that over the years, I've started to realize that nobody has a real good overview of Rembrandt's complete oeuvre. Because
yeah.
again, you either have books like the corpus that deal with the period of his paintings, or you have books on all the paintings, or you have books on all the drawings or all the etchings, but you don't have a book on everything.
Yeah, and people become obsessed with the late works or
Exactly.
the etchings, and so if you
Yeah.
find something that's sort of mid-career, yeah, it's hard to
You
pick
know,
it.
it's the same thing with Van Dyck and the same thing with Rubens and the same thing with Titian. It's all fragmented. And with Rubens,
Mm.
it's even worse because you've got 28 experts because they're all volumes were written by different people. I mean, all these great artists, in my view, are not really fully understood.
I completely agree.
And
Completely
that's
agree.
and
In
that is the
fact,
problem.
when you go on to YouTube, and there are many, many videos of artists trying to explain how Rembrandt painted,
Yeah.
and none of them are any good, in my opinion. They
No,
explain in such a bad way how the technique was, because no one really understands
no.
his technique. You know, he's very, it's
The
very,
thing
very
is,
unique.
you have to take not one, but probably 10 steps back in
Mm,
order to start to get an overview. So when Ernst van der Wetering died, and I worked very closely to him for, let's say, 6 years, and then we had a bit of a fallout and he died. And I started to sense that in a way, academically, I was standing on his shoulders. I could
mm,
very clearly see what he didn't know.
mm,
And instead of going on in his way, in his method, in his way of thinking and reflecting, I said, no, 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 I'm going to do it all over again, but I'm going to take several steps back to get a bigger helicopter view, overview of this oeuvre and start really from the very start again. And by doing that, I mean, again, the book that I've been talking about now in this interview, I've been working on it for more than 8 years. And there were
mm,
many moments where dear friends in my colleagues and friends in my friend group said, you know, publish the book,
mm,
finish it, just get on with it. And I'm very grateful that I've never done that
mm.
because I know that when we stop this interview, I will go back to Rembrandt and discover yet another little thing,
Yeah.
have a different view. And I feel maybe this is the intuition, but I'm not there yet. It will take
Mm,
another half year or so, and then I am very safe to publish the first bit. It will
mm,
again be many volumes, but the first bit will be the Leiden years, and I think I've sort of got the hang of Leiden now.
mm.
So it took me more than 8, 9 years to deal with 6 years of his career.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, when you're dealing with art, you're dealing with time. There's a certain quality of
Exactly.
time that's
Yeah.
very misunderstood in art. And so I feel that you're definitely your intuition's right. The longer you take, the longer you'll uncover the better quality of information
Yeah.
that you'll have in that book, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, when you're looking at you know, Rembrandt, especially Rembrandt paintings, but you know, old master paintings and things, you are literally looking at time.
Yeah.
It took time to paint. They have a different meaning because they are so old. There's many different aspects of time that you're dealing with.
Every painting or drawing or etching is a momentum. It's the moment the artist decides to stop.
Yeah,
What you're looking at is processes. And
yeah,
once you understand that a painting or an object is a momentum of a process instead of a finished thing, it's just a momentum in a process. You know, the artist could have gone on or could have stopped earlier on, but you should see it as a process. Then you start to think completely different of an oeuvre. But
absolutely.
but art historians are not trained like that. They're trained to look at an image.
Yeah.
They try to fit images next to each other, but it's processes that are aligned. It's a
Mm,
different way of thinking.
mm,
And you know, there are very few people that can actually do this. I mean, like yourself, if you make art, if you understand the battle of paint and
mm,
brushes and how to get a concept from your mind via your hand on a canvas, it's a process. It's a much
mm,
bigger thing than just the outcome, which is an
mm,
image and how to place that image to another image. That's a complete uh, infantile way of looking at art.
mm.
But it,
Absolutely.
but it's the
I mean, when I
dogmatic
started
way.
painting, if someone said to me, you know, if I said to them, look, I want to know how to paint, and then they said to me, it's going to take your whole life to
Yeah,
understand how to paint. You
easily.
might understand how to paint in your 80s.
Yeah.
I might not have started, but it's too far gone now. But you
No,
know
but
the last painting, they say it's the last painting, it was found on his easel when he died, the famous painting of what's the title of the work in it's Simeon in the Temple, is that?
yeah, Simeon in the temple.
And uh, we maybe step over the line again as we've discussed in this, but for me that painting does symbolize some sort of heartbreak, and he's almost holding his child up, like Rembrandt says almost in this painting, I've lost my child, I wish he was with me, kind of
Yeah.
thing. Am I reading too much into that? Because it's a heartbreaking image, that.
I think you know the answer, but it's there's that answer has no fun because
Mm,
it means you just don't know.
yeah.
It's very much possible that his neighbor said, I'm a Catholic and I have my little chapel in my home and I like a Simeon in the temple because my
Mm,
name is Simon or Simeon.
yeah.
God knows. It doesn't really matter. What I do know is that if you analyze that painting properly, you
Mm,
look at the condition, it's ruined. It's over restored.
right.
So the only things that is safe to say is that that picture was probably mishandled because it was
Mm,
not finished, and they tried to turn it into something nice to sell it to make a little bit of money out of it after he died. Didn't work out. Was restored, 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 and now it's chaos and it looks like an unfinished scrap, heap of scrap.
and is there any information about what else was in his studio when he died? Is there any
Yes, there,
information
there
about that?
is there's an inventory of things like a big helmet and a golden sword and God knows whatever sort of items, but it doesn't mean anything. Nothing
No, but
can be
what
traced.
paintings were there?
Oh, several, but it's done by a notary who didn't have a lot of understanding about art.
Right.
So there's a lot of painting keys, little paintings.
Was Claudius Civilis there? Or
No,
was no, that
no,
had gone. Were
no.
there any
Probably
self-portraits there?
cut in pieces. Well, and the one piece probably sold off that ended up in Sweden. Self ports. I no, I don't know. We would should take the list. You can
Yeah.
find the list online.
I mean, I almost think that Claudius Civilis painting is more of a Dutch work than the Night Watch. Almost, it's the
Certainly it
national.
was. Certainly it was. I mean, this is one of the big. Well, it's not really an enigma, but it's just very sad. Is that early on he painted the portrait of Andries de Graaf, and Andries was so not impressed, and he said, "I don't look like this sort of fluffy, ugly man." It turned into a lawsuit, and Andries lost because several people looked at the painting and said, "No, you actually do look like this." So, and Rembrandt won. And so when the decoration program of the town hall, which is now the Palace on Dam Square, was well, when that came into to being, the Graaf family was very, very in power, very much in power, and they said, as far as we think, whoever does it will find somebody who's great for this, but it's not Rembrandt.
Mm,
So they remembered 20 years earlier, you screwed us, we'll screw you back.
mm,
That I think is still slightly an assumption, but I think it's a safe assumption because in the De Graaf family holdings there were no Rembrandt paintings, and they put
wow,
all their money on Flink. There were many Flink paintings.
wow.
Of course, Flink painted probably half of the paintings, and Jacob Jordaan's the other half. So there
And
you.
there might be, I'm sure there is much, much more to that story. There was probably a little
Oh yeah, but
falling
if
out. They probably didn't
yeah,
get on. Maybe he came in to paint him drunk one day, or there's all
whatever,
kinds of things that
but
could have happened.
if we take the assumption that
Mm,
Rembrandt did paint him flatteringly nice in the late 30s, it could have led us to granting Rembrandt the full decoration of the Palace on the Dam Square, which would have meant that we would have a super palazzo with 20 mega Rembrandts.
yeah, and that would have been considered the version of the Night Watch that we look at now.
The Night Watch would be considered a Boy Scouts try
Right.
rubbish piece of nonsense compared
Yeah.
to what could have been.
Yeah. Yeah. Incredible. Just because that relationship didn't work.
And at the same time, I believe that because it didn't happen, we consider Rembrandt to be so great. Because it might be the case that if it did happen,
Mm,
it would have been too much Rembrandt. Like Rubens,
mm,
in a way, there's too much Rubens. If you
mm.
go to the Louvre, I never really liked the Medici cycle. I mean, I can walk there, I can look a bit around, but then it's too much. Too many students. It's too. Rembrandt couldn't have painted the whole palace on the Dam Square. He would have asked students to help out, and it would probably diminish the quality and the power of what he now left us.
Yeah. Well,
So
that you're right. That's the thing about Rubens' paintings is that the
yeah,
studio was too big that you're not
yeah.
looking at his. I mean,
So
when you're looking at a
everything,
good Rubens, they're incredible,
yeah,
but
exactly.
most of them aren't.
So everything has a good reason.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that the taking away of the Claudius Civilis from the building was good in hindsight. It
Mm.
led to a great thing.
It's just a shame. I went to the Rijksmuseum in 2015, 16, and it was there. Claudius Civilis.
Yes.
I think they were redeveloping the Swedish National Museum, and so they had given it back to lent it back to the Rijksmuseum, and it was there, and it just seemed so appropriate that it was
Yeah.
there, and it was an astonishing painting.
Yeah.
It just glowed like all the other paint. I mean, there's the St. Paul, Apostle St. Paul self-portrait that really impacted me, and the Claudius Civilis. Those two were there, hung together, and they just blew me away.
Did you ever go to Berlin to the Gemälde Galerie?
No, I haven't.
Now, do yourself a favor,
Mm.
book a flight or a ticket, go there, because the Moses and the two tables, or the Jacob wrestling the angel, those two paintings are probably from the same momentum as the Claudius Civilis in way of painting. And when you stand in front of those two paintings, and I think they have something like 26 paintings by Rembrandt, so you have a wonderful.
Really?
It's the biggest concentration of Rembrandt paintings outside of Holland.
Oh, wow.
You would have a lovely field day
Yeah.
just to sit there to see these two big long paintings that have that same glow. You'll love it. This is
I can't wait. No, I'm going to take you up on that.
okay.
Maybe we can go together, Jan.
I will be more than happy and thrilled to, but you have to tell me to shush, shush, because I keep on talking.
No, it's I can talk about Rembrandt for days and days and days, and I'm sure we'll talk again about Rembrandt as your book develops and as as the years go by. But listen, Jan, for now it's been absolutely an honor and a pleasure to speak to you about my favorite artist, Rembrandt, and let the conversations continue through the years. And
Yes.
thank you for joining us.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nick.
Bye.
Bye-bye.